Greetings everyone, and welcome to our second part of kind of a three-part mini-series, I guess I'll call it, on early Soviet history. This lecture follows the one that I did rather previously on the Russian Revolution, which I would strongly suggest having a look at before you do this one, because we're going to continue right from where they left off after November, once the Bolsheviks had taken power. And you know, there was a lot of difficulty ahead of them, and a lot of it, some of it was self-inflicted, some of it was completely out of their control. You have to consider that when the Russian Revolution happens, particularly the big one in November of 1917, the rest of Europe was very much distracted by the war on the Western Front. And certainly by the time the Russians pull out of the war, which they will do at the treaty above, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, will basically be the end of the Russian venture on the Eastern Front. All those German troops have now moved to the west, and I know that there was a tremendous amount of anger and frustration with this new Russian government. Not only were the Western allies concerned about this new communist government and were troubled by events in Russia, but they were equally as perturbed at the idea that they now had to deal with a doubling up of the German army on the Western Front. I suppose if there was any saving grace in all of this, where the Great War is concerned, is the fact that the previous April of that same year, 1917, the United States had declared war, and they were really now beginning to sort of filter into France and getting trained and getting outfitted, and everything's ready to go. And the great thing with the American presence was that they were fresh troops, they were filled with enthusiasm and filled with energy, and they haven't, of course, learned the hard, brutal realities yet of trench warfare. But for the most part, the introduction of American troops as Russian troops pulled out of this war maintained a certain equilibrium, if you will, on the Western Front. So back to Russia now with Lenin, who's now taken power. You might recall from my last lecture that he made three basic promises to the Russian people. He told them, I will give you peace, I will give you bread, and I will give you land. Now, keep in mind that Lenin and many of his leading Bolshevik accomplices are intellectuals. They are highly educated. They are very well versed in political theory, economics, history, philosophy, you name it. However, the common peasant in Russia can't even read. And how do you mobilize a sort of a group of people who are not only uneducated, illiterate, but they're spread out over thousands and thousands of miles through a vast terrain in Western Russia? How do you mobilize those people? Well, all Lenin could do in the immediate part of this revolutionary period is to get peace. And he knew well that that was the one greatest fallback, or the one greatest error, if you will, of the provisional government. Kerensky's provisional government was their desire to stay in the war. So what's interesting is Lenin sends Trotsky, his military commander, who would later lead the Red Army during the Civil War period. He sends him in December of 1917 to meet with German officials to talk about peace. And I guess the peace treaty was so punitive that when Trotsky came back to Russia, he told Lenin, he said, look, we can't sign this thing. It is absolutely, you're not going to stand it. It's terrible. The terms are completely punitive. And Lenin's reaction was, I don't care what they want. Give them whatever they want. We have to get out of this war. Our revolution cannot continue unless we are free from fighting this war. So as a result, in March 1918, signed was the terms known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So let's continue. And as I said, as a key component of peace-bred land, Lenin realized he must end the war with Germany. He opposed the war from the start, but recognized the benefits. You might recall last lecture I did mention that he once said that, of course, the war was a splendid little thing for the revolution. And also when soldiers begin to side with the revolutionaries, he said that the soldiers voted with their feet, so to speak. So, you know, there was this sense that the war was very helpful for the Bolshevik cause in the long run. Peace would secure support from peasants and workers and allow him to deal with internal enemies. One of the great conundrums of revolutions, and you know the Americans faced this, the French faced it, is the idea that once you have a revolution and you take control of government, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's on the same page as you. Of course there's going to be people that oppose your revolution, but a lot of those people might go into hiding. A lot of those people may pretend to be on the side of the revolution, and you really don't know who your friends and enemies are. In the case of the Bolshevik Revolution, I will stand by sort of my thesis that, and I don't think this is anything unique, I know other historians have made the same claim, I just happen to agree with it, that this was a coup d'etat, meaning that it was a small group of tightly organized militants taking over the seat of government. Because from there, then the Bolsheviks have to let everybody else know in Russia that they're in control. So when they signed the peace, there were many people in Russia who were already very concerned, particularly former Tsarist officials, and who were very upset about where this revolution could take them. So there's a lot of opposition to the revolution. March 3rd, 1918, peace was signed. Russia lost its richest areas, including 26% of Russia's population fell under German control. 27% had farmland, and most of that farmland rather was the best, like the breadbasket of Europe, if you will. 26% of our railways and 74% of iron ore and coal. Is it any wonder that Trotsky went back in December and told Lenin, we can't sign this? But Lenin, his goal was the success of the revolution by any means necessary. So, all right, and I actually wanted to come back here just to show you, I don't know how clear this map is on your screen, but this is the Black Sea, the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans are down here, and this is a section of Russia. You can see the whole section that Germany took was also the section that bordered on the Black Sea. So, you know, they had some pretty grand designs of controlling a vast, the most productive part of the Russian Empire. All right. Well, as I said before, as soon as the Bolsheviks take power, enemies who were opposed to the Bolsheviks began to kind of come together. And so in a very general sense, it's a war between the Bolsheviks, who we'll refer to as the Reds, as they were referred to often in the Civil War, and their political opponents, the Whites. Now the Reds were one single unified group, but the Whites were a scattering of organizations, and I'll outline them shortly. Just months after seizing power, the Bolsheviks faced significant opposition from army officers, numerous nationalities, and various foreign armies, right? So the problem with the Whites right off the bat is that you have a lot of small groups of organizations that are really working out of self-interest. The ethnic minorities see it as an opportunity to break from Tsarist or Russian control. Army officers see it as an opportunity to reassert the monarchy to some capacity. And foreign armies see it as an opportunity to destabilize this young revolutionary government. So they're all kind of doing their own thing. They're not a single unified army, where the Bolsheviks were. The Whites were a collection of factions whose only commonality was their mutual disdain for the Bolsheviks. By no means were they unified, were they as unified as the Reds were. Although outnumbered and less well equipped, the Reds controlled the industrial centers and the extensive railway networks. Okay. here's the essential advantage that the Reds have during the Russian Civil War. They are in the center. They control the all lines of communication, and that all the white armies were sort of fighting on the periphery of this unified center. You know, you have Czech legions in the south fighting for Czech Republic. You have religious groups off the Black Sea fighting for, you know, the reassertion of Christian control or whatever it may be. You have army officers in the north. You know, so they're all kind of gathered around trying to destabilize this government for their own self-interest, obviously. Under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, who becomes the war commissar, the Red Army became a regular army with conscription. Former Tsarist officers were forced to leave the armies. So here you can see some pictures of armies coming together. Now, you might recall that at the time of the revolution, there were only 350,000 people that kind of considered themselves card-carrying Bolsheviks, if you will. So you have to basically head out into the rural communities and basically tell people what's going on. So, you know, the Red Army would roll into a village somewhere and people would come out and say, "Oh, who are you guys?" "Oh, we're the Red Army." "Oh, what's that?" "We're the new government." "Oh, what about the Tsar?" "Oh no, he abdicated." "Oh, well, what are you guys gonna do?" "Well, that's why we're here. We're coming to tell you what we need you to do." So right off the bat, there are quite a few demands that the Bolsheviks are going to make of the peasant population, and that creates all kinds of problems during certainly the war communism phase of this Civil War period. As far as Tsarist officers being forced to leave the Red Army, is basically how you do it, is you put their families under house arrest. And you tell them that either you lead these armies or you and your family will be executed. I mean, it's crass and horrible and brutal, but that's basically how you got these army officers to lead the Red Armies. You threatened them. By May 1918, there was a full-scale civil war and also an Allied intervention. Now, what on earth could the Allies possibly have that would drive them to get involved in Russia when they are facing a horror show on the Western Front? You know, a continuing battles of attrition and brutality on the Western Front, yet they managed to muster up energy to invade Russia. And I'll explain sort of why and how that happened, because Allied intervention is a huge part of this Civil War narrative, because what it does is it sends a real strong message to the Bolsheviks that not only do the people with many elements within your country not like you, not only are people on your border regions not favorable to you, but all the Western allies who were Russia's previous enemies, or allies, excuse me, don't like you either. And you know, what happens with Allied intervention is it really creates a real siege mentality that everyone's out to get us. I mean, there was already a heightened sense of emotion in Russia because revolutions are not a dinner party. You know, as Mao Zedong would later say, they are an act of one class overthrowing another, I think is what he said. But this was truly revolutionary, and there was a constant state of terror and fear that existed in this country. So the million-dollar question is, why did they get involved? Well, initially, the Allies got involved to protect arms shipments. Okay, let me explain. Russia and Britain and France were allies in a war against the Central Powers, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and later the Ottomans as well. So what had happened is the Allies would send munitions and supplies for the war to Russia through the northern ports. So I don't know how well you will see this map, but probably, well, basically if you go all the way around Finland, Norway, and Sweden, on the back side there are two locations named Archangel and Murmansk. So Great Britain is over here, France is here. This isn't a very good map, I'm not sure what's going on here, but either way, they would send troops, supplies around here. And what happened was, just before the Bolshevik takeover, the Allies had sent a significant amount of armaments to the Tsar's government. When the revolution happened and the Tsar pulls out, the Allies say, well, wait a second here, we got to get back there to Murmansk and Archangel and retrieve all those supplies that we gave to the Tsar for the war, because now we need them for the war, and they pulled out. So when those troops arrive, they are given sort of haphazard orders to, while you're there, give the Bolsheviks a run for their money. We don't like them anyway. You know, and there was activity not only up here, but there was intervention from underneath here. There was intervention in Vladivostok. In fact, right from Victoria, British Columbia, a significant amount of troops left from Victoria, went all the way across the Pacific and got involved in the Civil War there as well. So yeah, initially the Allies got involved to protect arms shipments, sorry, that's the second part, sent to the Tsar's Russia during their war with Germany. The Bolsheviks' repudiation of Tsarist debt, meaning that the Bolsheviks said, whatever the Tsar's government owed you or owes you, that's not our debt, we're not paying anything. So they repudiate any debt. The confiscation of private property and the advocacy of world revolution also struck fear into the West. So nobody wanted in the West to see this young Bolshevik communist government to survive. I mean, the reality was that, you know, left-wing socialist communist parties had existed throughout Europe since the middle 19th century, and they'd always been a bit of a thorn in the side to all the Western democracies and constitutional monarchies and everything in between. So the real fear was, what the heck are we going to do if we've got this monolithic symbol in Russia who can now serve as an inspiration to all those parties that are a headache to us, you know. So the fear was the symbolism of having a nation guided by the principles of Marxism. And you can't have that. I mean, even Winston Churchill was asked, you know, what's with all this, what's with this invasion of Russia? Why are we getting involved in a Russian civil war? And Churchill's response says, well, you got to kill the baby while it's still in the crib, right? Which is a pretty, I've said before in another lecture, that's a pretty crass metaphor, but it makes the point, right? He understood that the long-term impact of the success of a communist state would have, as I say, long-term geopolitical consequences, because they will become a symbol. And not only that, the Soviet Union, I believe they officially proclaimed their name the USSR not till 1922, until after the Civil War. But, you know, they were actively advocating world revolution. Like, hey, you know what, we've done it, now you can do it. If you do, we'll support you. So there was a real fear in the West of what this whole government represented. In all, 15 countries intervened in this Allied intervention. Canadians were there, I should note as well. The Turks, Romanians, Czechs, Poles, Greeks, Japanese, and the Western Allies, Britain, France, Canada, USA. So it seemed like everybody was trying to undermine Lenin's government from all directions. And this is in addition to the internal enemies that were fighting against the Bolsheviks as well. Now, I do believe, and I'm not making excuses for the Bolsheviks, but I do believe that the combination of the Allied intervention and the combination of a civil war they're fighting right on their own turf created a real strong siege mentality that I believe really encouraged the more brutal and totalitarian nature of the state. I mean, it was heading in that direction anyway, but much like the Great Terror in the French Revolution, it's the same thing. In order to protect ourselves from our internal and our external enemies, we need to clamp down and you know, if we have to suspend all civil liberties and do everything, it's a temporary measure until we win this civil war. So, you know, one could make that argument. Here we go, I say it here, a siege mentality would greatly influence the authoritarian nature of the Bolshevik regime in the years following the Civil War. And once again, I'm not suggesting that the West is to blame for the authoritarian nature of the Bolshevik regime, but I think it fed it and fueled it. It gave cause for the legitimacy for the use of terror and kind of intolerance and secret police and brutal tactics to achieve their end. And of course that's what they do. So during the Civil War in the Soviet Union, hunger, starvation haunted the countryside. I mean, you know, here are a bunch of young kids who are starving. The Soviet Union had no friends, and everybody was out to extinguish them. The fact that the Bolsheviks actually win and continue to build this state is truly remarkable from strictly a military perspective, regardless of whether you agree or like or whatever it is you feel about them. It's a pretty remarkable thing that with all these obstacles working against them, including famine, they managed to kind of keep it together. Well, during the Civil War, the government adopted something called war communism, an emergency program of extreme centralization, grain requisitioning, and labor mobilization. Why did they implement this brutal form of communism? Because they needed to ensure that the Red Armies were fed. They're the ones on the front line defending their new regime, but we need to make sure we feed them by all means necessary. So basically you've mobilized your labor force who are now going to have to work X amount of hours. They have to produce this many crops. They have to give up that percentage to the state. And peasants who are still trying to wrap their heads around this new government are saying, well, wait a second here. We never had anything like this during the Tsar's government. Maybe we like that better. Maybe we want to go back. We don't necessarily like what we're experiencing right now. Peasants were forced to give up all their surplus crops to the government in order to feed the Red Army. The Cheka, or secret police, that's what they were called in the early days, the Cheka, carried out the policies often brutally. Lacking incentive and resenting nationalization, the peasants reduced crops and agricultural output dropped. So here, this to me is cornerstone to why many communist societies in the 20th century failed to succeed. Because if there is no incentive for your hard work, other than supporting the brotherhood of the nation and serving the will of the people or whatever it may be, people are going to lose interest in working their buns off if they're not getting anything back for their hard work. And particularly during the war communism phase, grain was being taken from them. So they're thinking, well, if you guys are just going to roll in with the troops and take all the grain, what the heck is the point of me working my butt off? You know? And I don't want to sound cynical, and I don't want to suggest that the Russian peasants were lazy or what have you. They just couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of putting so much energy and time and effort into doing something where they received absolutely nothing in return. So, you know, it's a problem. The Bolsheviks compounded the disasters of war, foreign intervention, and civil war by declaring war on the productive elements of society. Squads of armed men went into the countryside and seized grain from the peasants. The peasants fought with fists, axes, clubs, anything that came to hand, and when they could not conceal their grain, they burned it. It got so contentious in some parts of Russia that peasants said, we are not giving you anything. You do not deserve, you do not have the right to take what we're growing. So they began to defend themselves, get that, from the Red Army, who is coming to take away their grain. So they said, well, look, if we can't fight you and defeat you, then we're going to torch it. You know, there were mass burnings of grain because the peasants refused to give it up to the state. So you have declared war on the productive elements of society. I mean, this is madness, some would say, right? You know, what on earth is going on? Private industry disappeared almost entirely, and compulsory labor was introduced. War communism was seen by the Bolsheviks as necessary if the new government was to succeed. I guess if the end justifies the means, to use a term from Machiavelli, I believe, said that. That was his thinking. You know, Lenin said, we got to feed the Red Army, they've got to eat, and they've got to win this thing, and you guys are good. It's going to be born on the back of the peasants, right? The very people that he claimed to represent. So it's getting ugly. Well, how on earth, under these kind of conditions, did the Bolsheviks actually win and were able to move forward? Few believe that the Bolsheviks could survive the ordeal rather of war, communism, civil war, and Allied intervention. But here's what the advantage was. The Bolsheviks controlled the heart of Russia, including Moscow and Petrograd, most of its population, and much of its industry. The Reds enjoyed the inner line of communication, I'd like to call it, while their opponents had to shift around the periphery, right? So if you've got the heart and you can defend your whole inner border, everyone else is just jabbing at you from the periphery. And eventually people lost interest or they just faded away and left. Bolsheviks were seen as nationalist. They required no foreign help. However, a crushing famine in 1921 and a rebellion at Kronstadt Naval Base in March 1921 brought a few realities to Lenin and his government. Once the Civil War was over and the Bolsheviks were victorious, there were cracks in the system. And Kronstadt was huge, where the Navy said, we are not serving your goals. We are not sailing out. We're not going to do what we're told. Lenin realized that moderation was necessary if his regime was to survive. Now I should note, and I don't have a slide here, but I've been meaning to put one in relation to the Romanovs, because what happened to them? Well, Nicholas, Alexei, Alexandra, and his, I believe, 3 daughters. I believe Anastasia was one of them. I can't remember the name, but I believe there were 4 children. Were put under house arrest during the Civil War period. And basically what happens is, you know, there's a back and forth between the whites making progress and then the Reds moving forward and then the whites coming forward. And there was a point in the Civil War where the white armies were getting quite close to where the royal family was being held in captivity. And Lenin made the decision to have them executed, and they were brought down into the room of the house where they were being held. I believe they were told they were going to be taking some family portraits of some kind, so they all had their nice clothes on. And I guess you know, then they closed the door, and you know, by decree of the Bolshevik government, you know, the order has been given that you be shot. So they were actually told, and of course, you know, Tsar Nicholas was like, what? He was mortified, and then the bullets rained, and you know, I believe that the Tsar and Alexandra died immediately, but the children had to be gunned down, and it was just a brutal, horrible affair. But no, Anastasia did not escape or get away, as far as I understand it. But you know, what was interesting is there were feelers to Great Britain for his, you know, his cousins to provide, you know, a home for them, but they waffled on the idea. I don't know why George decided, or no, it would have been George, yeah, George, why he decided to not give asylum, if you will, to the Romanovs, but it never happened, and as a result they were executed. I mean, it's a pretty horrible circumstance and a real tragedy for Nicholas, because as we talked about in the lecture on the Russian Revolution, he was really quite a decent human being, and he was a loving father, a good husband, shy, introverted, would have made a perfect, well, he made a perfect family man, but he just was not destined to be a strong monarch. So a real tragic situation. Well, Lenin's next move, after all the peasants' population had been through, combined with rising discontent with the communist authority, Lenin installed an incentive program. Okay, let me repeat that again. An incentive program. Not very socialistic by any means, but this was where a certain degree of pragmatism came into Lenin's policies, where he realized that he had to do whatever. The war was over, the Civil War was over, he needed to please the peasants. He needed to prove to them that he was actually on their side. Peasants handed over a fixed proportion of their crops as a tax to the state, and anything above they could keep or sell privately. Incentive schemes were set up to encourage more production. The government even allowed a limited use of hired labor in agriculture. Wow, that sounds like exploitation to me, to use a Marxist term. During the height of the new economic policy, 75% of retail trade fell into private hands. What do you think happened to productivity? Well, it went through the roof, right? Because now you get to keep a percentage of what you produce. It doesn't matter how much or how little. You're giving X amount to the state and you're keeping X amount. So the more you produce, the more you get to keep. Basic market economics, right? And so, you know, capitalism is what saves the communist state. A new class of small businessmen called NEP men, New Economic Policy men, grew in the cities, and kulaks, who were wealthy peasants, developed in the countryside. Kulaks are very, very wealthy peasants. Maybe they're wealthy because they work hard, they're good at farming, they hire people, and they're very, very productive. And later, of course, when Stalin comes into power, he will go to war against the kulaks. So this new class worried many communists, and these ideological arguments came to be closely linked to personalities and to the struggles for power that gained momentum after Lenin's death in January 1924. I mean, when Lenin dies in 1924, the two main figures who were in a position to gain power would be Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And the big question about do we keep this new economic policy was, of course, one of the major debates and discussions. So that being said, there's a nice piece of propaganda. This is the kind of poster you would see. Here's the Soviet Union. We're the center of the workers' struggle. You know, that this kind of imagery was coming out of the Soviet Union. We are we support all communist organizations around the world, and so in many ways, very, very early on in the Russian Revolution, the symbolism of a communist state became very, very troubling to the West. So, that being said, next lecture we will be looking at the Stalin years, and we'll be looking at specifically his early years as a young man in Georgia. And from there we'll move into how he gained power and focus on his reign from 1928 to 1939. We'll stop at the Nazi-Soviet Pact because we'll talk quite a bit about the Soviets during the three-part lecture I have on the Second World War, and more we'll talk about Stalin when we get to the early Cold War as well. So Stalin casts a very large shadow over Soviet and Russian history. And anyway, so thank you very much for continuing this series, and we look forward to have you watch the next one on Stalin. Thank you very much.